Hey, fellow superhero cinephiles. Did you know that almost 30% of adults say they haven't read a book in the past year? The primary reason why is a lack of time. Well, Audible's here to help with the gift of found time. Thanks to Audible, you can listen to audiobooks like Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, or Slugfest, inside the epic 50-year battle between Marvel and DC. Read up on the history of superheroes in comics and movies with Grant Morrison's Super Gods. You can also check out Vanguard, my original superhero novel series, or try The Vril Agenda or The Adventures of Fortune McCall, both of which were written by our dearly departed host emeritus, Derrick Ferguson. Whatever you're looking for, Audible has thousands of titles that you can consume while commuting, exercising, cooking, or just relaxing at home. And not only audiobooks, an Audible membership also gives you access to tons of content like podcasts, theatrical performances, and exclusive Audible originals that you won't find anywhere else. To give you a taste of what you can get, Audible has partnered with this show to provide listeners with a free 30-day trial. All you have to do is go to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod, and with your free trial, you get one free audiobook and 2 free Audible originals. In fact, you get to keep those titles even if you cancel before the trial is over. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod and start your free trial today. Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine. We got a very special episode today. A while back, those who've been listening to the show for a long time know that way back in the early episodes, Derrick and I had talked about doing an episode about superheroes in politics, which we never actually got around to doing, unfortunately. And since his passing, obviously, we won't be able to do it. But in light of some recent events in the news that have happened, I thought this is a really good time. This is a really topical thing to talk about. And I could think of nobody better than my guest today. And that is he's a political scientist as well as a superhero expert and a fellow podcaster, an author. And that is Allen Plexico. Van, how you doing today?
Hey, Perry, I'm really happy to join you today. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad to have you on. So before we jump into it, why don't you take a few minutes, tell people about yourself?
I am a political science and history professor at Southwestern Illinois, and I've done that for almost 30 years now, and I write pulp novels, superheroes, particularly the 9-volume Sentinels superhero novel series that started back in 2005. And I write a lot of other stuff too, science fiction, fantasy, and I also am the publisher of White Rocket Entertainment, which we do podcasts, videos, books, comics. Got a Pulsar Sentinels comic, obviously, that you're involved in coming out very soon. Really excited about that, and just a whole bunch of stuff like that. So I do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun working on that, doing the lettering on that, and also the Cold Lightning comic as well, which you've been working on. But anyway, today the reason we brought you on is to kind of merge these two worlds together of superheroes and politics, because I know when I first approached you about this, you hadn't seen the news. I'm not sure if you caught up on it since, but there's this whole kerfluffle because you know what it usually is. It's anytime there's a slow news day or something, Fox News looks at what's going on in comic books and decides to throw a hissy fit about it. And this one was about the United States of Captain America, which is a new series Marvel has launched. And in the series, Steve Rogers is kind of going across the country, and he's meeting all these different people who are kind of taking up the mantle of Captain America, coming from different walks of life and all that. And the series opens with Steve kind of questioning his role as Captain America and saying that, the American dream, it's an ideal, but, for a lot of people, for a lot of communities, it can easily become a nightmare, or it doesn't exist whatsoever. And that pissed off Fox News, or, they pretended to be pissed off about it. And so then they brought on Dean Cain, of all people, to talk about it because because he played Superman, he played a very bad Superman several years ago, and so they
Yeah.
thought he's a comic book expert. Um, which, ironically enough, later he mentioned on Twitter when someone called him out about the comic book. He said, "Well, I haven't read the comic book, but I stand by what I said."
Yeah, there's a shock.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, their thing is to say the country is not. It's the country's going to hell. Everything is bad and dark and scary, and it's because we're not being like it was in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
So if anything is moving forward and not being like the 1950s, it's therefore bad, and we have to change it back. And that's just their attitude. And so, of course, if but Captain America is supposed to reflect America. When we're in World War II and we're having to fight physically against the Nazis, he's punching Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's the 70s and there's things like the Klan and there's Watergate and all, then his job is to react to that, as he did. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that in an age where we're concerned about the plight of the poor and minorities and are they getting a fair shake in our society, that's his job, is to reflect those concerns in a comic booky way. And that's 100%. That's how it's always been.
Well, Captain America is a really good place to start, because obviously that's what launched this whole latest hissy fit, and also going back to what a lot of people don't realize is when they look back at Captain America and that famous cover of him punching Hitler in Captain America Comics #1. A lot of people, in hindsight, they have this impression that, oh, well, that was wartime propaganda. But the thing is, that issue actually came out before America even entered the war.
Yeah, I mean, that's well, there's a lot to unpack there, honestly. But I mean, yeah, there were. Well, I think a good place to start is like the recent HBO series, "The Plot Against America."
Oh, I just watched that fairly recently. Yeah.
Yeah, it does a good job of showing the America First movement was really a bunch of, very like anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi sympathizer things. And just because you call yourself America First doesn't mean that you really have all of America that you're putting first. It's any more than the Nazis calling themselves National Socialists meant they were socialists. I mean,
exactly.
These names are very useful, but they aren't always the truth. So yeah, I mean, I think that reflects that there were quite a few Americans who felt like we did need to do something about the rise of fascism in Europe and its corresponding rise here to a certain degree, and that was an editorial view. I mean, that wasn't an. I mean, you make a good point that it wasn't an action shot from a current news story. It was an editorial viewpoint of where they wanted things to go.
Yeah.
Which is a totally different thing.
Yeah, because you remember it's, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, they're these working class Jewish kids.
Exactly.
They came from very impoverished backgrounds. Also, Siegel and Shuster with Superman as well. Early Superman comics, it was all about, those early Superman comics. He wasn't fighting Brainiac and Doomsday and Darkseid and all that. He was fighting slumlords.
Mm-hmm. I had the author of the Chowderhead Chronicles on my show recently. It's basically Ready Player One for comics geeks.
Oh, nice.
And there's this cool scene where all these like white Aryan, pro Hitler guys are picketing in front of Marvel, and that actually happened.
Yeah.
And I was talking to him about it, and he said that they were they like called up to the Marvel offices and were demanding to see Jack Kirby or something. And Jack says, "I'll be right down." When he got down there, they were gone. They didn't want any part of Jack. So yeah, they were. Yeah.
Jack had no qualms about punching Nazis. Like, that was his thing. Oh. That was why he enlisted in the army in the first place. And one of his most famous quotes is, "The only politics I ever had was if somebody liked Hitler, I'd beat the stuffing out of him, and that was that."
That was that, yeah. Well, he was Ben Grimm. I mean, that's who Jack Kirby was. He was Ben Grimm.
Yeah, he was exactly. Yeah, Ben Grimm was such Jack Kirby wish fulfillment. It was
Mm-hmm.
That was him, right down to the cigar and Yancey Street and all that. That was, and him being Jewish as well. Like, a lot of people don't forget about that about Ben Grimm, is that he is a Jewish character, and that all comes from Kirby. So much so that when the Thing died in Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo's run on Fantastic Four, and the rest of the team went to heaven to get them, God was drawn as Jack Kirby.
I haven't read that one, but that totally makes sense. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, it was called, I think it was called The Hereafter was the name of the story arc. It was during Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo's run back in the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken.
I had to check that out. That sounds cool.
And going back to the Plot Against America and the America First movement, there's a book, you may know about this. I haven't read it myself, but I've heard a lot about it from the Behind the Bastards podcast, which also does a lot of talk about fascism and all that. And it's called Hitler's American Friends. And it talked about the America First movement and Charles Lindbergh, and like, people don't realize that there was actually a fascist, demonstration, a fascist, gathering at Madison Square Garden, of all places.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always have to explain to my students, because I'm here near St. Louis, and everything around here is still named Lindbergh. But I always tell them, this is the only place pretty much in the country that's still the case, because, 80, 90 years ago, stuff all over the country was named Lindbergh, and then they all got rid of it, except for St. Louis, because of the spirit of St. Louis and all that.
Yeah.
That's the only reason. So, yeah, people don't realize that, because he was there's a Bill Bryson book called One Summer 1927 that talks a lot about Lindbergh, and I had never thought of it this way, but Lindbergh was a bigger superhero than any superhero there's ever been in that moment. If you went back to 1927, 28, 29, he was the biggest hero that there had ever been and probably ever will be in the entire planet, because prior to that, the whole planet couldn't know about something all at the same time.
Right.
After that, there's too much. But he came along at just that moment when everybody could know about something happening in the news, and yet there wasn't a flood of 5 new people every day that are a hero or something. And so he was, to quote the Beatles, he was bigger than Jesus for like 3 years, because he was the only global celebrity, basically. And so when it came out that he was such a Nazi sympathizer and pro-Hitler and everything, it was a real shock to much of America, and his reputation, slid and slid. And there was sympathy too over the kidnapping of the baby and everything.
Right.
So there's a whole lot there. That's quite a story of highs and lows and good and evil. And it's as big as any big superhero, comic story. They ought to do something like that.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Plot Against America, because I hadn't even thought about that for this episode, but having just watched it, I think like maybe last month, because I never really knew much about Lindbergh, over the course of my life. It's because, like you said, like the fascist sympathies and all that, like his role in history has been downplayed a lot. And one of the things that Plot Against America did really well was illustrate just how big of a celebrity he was at that time.
Yeah, he could have got elected president, I think, for sure. And it would have been very bad for a whole lot of people. And I thought another interesting, I don't want to spoil too much of that show if people want to watch it, but I'll be very vague here. One thing that show did that I thought was very effective was that they showed how he could enable a movement without being 100% evil into it himself.
Right.
He wasn't American Hitler. He was just an American Hitler enabler. There were worse people than him, and that kind of becomes obvious over the course of the show. But because he was so popular, he opened the door for much worse, which in some ways is just as bad, right?
Right. Well, you see the same kind of thing with what's happening now in America too, with Donald Trump. But before Donald Trump, you had George W. Bush and Karl Rove and all that, and contributing slowly, like this whole death by 1,000 paper cuts type of thing.
Yeah, it's turning up the heat slowly rather than all at once so that it shocks everybody. You just, I mean, that's there's another great example of how this kind of thing slowly creeps in. If you've seen Babylon 5, they do a great job on there of covering over the course of 5 seasons the slow rise of fascism within a democratically elected government. Mm-hmm. And it's like in one season, there's like an assassination. And then another season, they've declared martial law, but for reasons of there's violence, they had to, Right. And in the third season, we're going to keep the martial law, and now we're going to have this organization with armbands that goes around and checks on everybody, but just for your own safety, Mm-hmm. And it just more and more until ultimately you have to actually do something about it. So yeah, that's another really good portrayal with Straczynski. Yeah.
I'll have to check that out because it's on HBO Max now. So I've been meaning to watch that after hearing people like you talking about it for years now.
And Andy Fix and I are doing a bi-weekly review of the series as it goes along. So check that out.
Nice. Yeah. And also that, because that's what happened in Nazi Germany too. Like it wasn't just an overnight thing. And like people looking at it in retrospect, they think it's like, oh, well, Hitler took over and then it was the Holocaust. And like, well, no, it was slowly over time. And there's a reason the Holocaust was called the final solution. It's because they had done a lot of other stuff before that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, yeah. Because you have to understand that the German population, just like the American people, are for the most part, educated and intelligent and culturally advanced people. Mm-hmm. I've always said that, before World War II, there's an argument that Germany was one of the 4 or 5 most educated, advanced, progressive people on earth in some ways, which is all the more shocking that they could fall for Hitler. But on the other hand, it's a great cautionary tale that anybody can fall for the Pied Piper with the message that is appealing in a particular, we're not immune to it. I mean, We just saw in our most recent election that, while 80 whatever million people apparently have common sense, 70 something million are like, oh, give me more fascism. That sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that was one of the things, and I'm glad you mentioned that too about pre-World War II Germany, because that was something else I've started to find out more about in the past year or so, was about what the Weimar Republic was like and just how progressive it was. Like they even were talking about trans rights back then. I mean, that's something that in America didn't even come up until the past, 5 years or so.
Sure. Yeah, no, they the big problem there is that Europe has always had a much broader political spectrum. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you give me just a second to get turned into political science mode.
No, absolutely, go right ahead.
In the United States, the global political spectrum, you have the far, far left, which is communism, the far, far right is fascism. The United States is kind of dead center. Mm-hmm. We're like right in the middle. And our Democrats are a little left of center, our Republicans a little right of center, depending on the year, depending on the person, depending on the party.
Right.
Though that's not always been the case, because, as I always point out, only in the last 40 years has ideology been the main dividing factor between the parties. Mm-hmm. More than 40 years ago, there was geography, there was slavery, there was a lot of other stuff. Mm-hmm. In the last 40 years, it's been ideology, because you used to have conservative Democrats like George Wallace and liberal Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller. So there's been... If this is new, okay, people think this is how it's always been. This is new. So America is like a small segment of that very broad ideological spectrum. We don't have very much beyond our narrow borders on each side. There's not a lot of real, we talk about it, but there's not a lot of real communists running around here. And there's not a lot of real fascists, although I'm getting concerned. But in Europe, there's always been a lot on every inch of that spectrum.
Yeah.
And so in the Weimar Republic in Germany, again, if you can picture the ideological views of America as like a triangle, like a peak with most in the middle, Europe was more like a V with most on the ends. There weren't a lot of moderates. There weren't a lot of centrists. You were either with the communists or you were with the fascists. And what Hitler did in the 30s was go to the really rich, powerful German industrialists and say, look, my side can win or their side can win. If my side wins, you get big government contracts. If their side wins, they execute you and redistribute your stuff to the people. So do you want fascism or do you want communism? And given a choice of those are the only two options, people took the fascism, which I can kind of understand if I'm a rich guy sitting on a pile of money and have a factory and I know that I can either keep running it for evil or it goes away entirely and I'm dead. As a chance, I might keep running it for evil, you know.
Right.
So
And I believe something also similar happened in Italy too with Mussolini, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because communism makes such a great bugaboo, boogeyman, that you say it's that or me. I mean, that's what Trump did, right? He said it's me or socialism. And socialism is communism, and Venezuela, boom.
Yeah. Well, I was actually just watching right before we recorded. Just by chance, I happened to be watching the original Manchurian Candidate, and same exact thing. Like Iceland is doing all that build up about the communist threat and all that, which is very much influenced by what McCarthy had actually done in America at that time.
Oh yeah, great movie. Yeah,
it was amazing. Yeah,
my political theory classes, I would show it because it really shows how. I mean, I think even more instructive than the like the A plot in that movie, which is the guy that's been brainwashed and to serve the communists and all that. While it does criticize the communists, it also criticizes the other side because you've got that McCarthy figure who just keeps pulling numbers out of his rear end. Of there's Heinz 57 communists. So it does a really good job of kind of exposing both of the extremes as being too extreme, I think.
Well, yeah, it's that whole and I know it's problematic in some ways, but that whole horseshoe analogy of political ideologies, where the further away you get from the center, eventually they kind of start acting like each other.
Yeah, because what you're referring to, I use a diamond chart, and because what it does is it has the bottom there's five sections, but the bottom section of that diamond is authoritarianism, just dictatorship of some kind. On the left side of that section is left-leaning dictatorship, which is communism. On the right side is right-leaning dictatorship, which is fascism. One gives you a little more control over your money, but less over your life. The other gives you a little more control over your life, but less over your money. And so they're both down there in the dictatorship section. They're just different kinds of dictatorship.
Right.
And if you go to the opposite, to the vertical opposite, you have anarchy and libertarianism. Is kind of
right. Well, which is another interesting thing because I took one of those political ideology tests type things they have, and it classified me as a libertarian socialist. Was how which seems like a contradiction, but the way you're describing it actually makes sense.
Yeah. I'm trying to. I guess that would be higher up. You're away from dictatorship, but with a little more of the government regulating the economy.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So and Japan's kind of like that too, as far as the political ideologies with Europe, because it's very much the same parliamentary system. Because the oldest political party in Japan is the Japan Communist Party, and although they're not technically a communist party, they're actually a democratic socialist party, but they still keep the name and that all goes back to stuff that happened in the 1950s, the 1960s. That was when you had a lot of militant left-leaning groups in Japan come out. So that, and there were some that allied with the PLO. And so there's a whole bunch of history there. In fact, there's if anyone's interested in this, there's a podcast called Against Japanism, which kind of goes into a lot of this history as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so taking it back to superheroes, what are some of the biggest examples? Obviously, Captain America, right? Captain America has always been political. I mean, when people talk about, I wish comic books weren't so political, but Captain America has always been rooted in politics. Like even in the 1940s, it was all about, fighting against fascism. And in the 1950s, during the Red Scare, it was all, you had the anti-communist stuff. And then you had these pockets where he wasn't political, like, Jack Kirby was coming in and doing his weird sci-fi stuff. But most of the time, especially when people think about the best Cap stories, they're all rooted in politics of the time.
Yeah, everything from Nomad to Civil War is all about dealing with the government and how the government wants to treat people or treat superheroes. I mean, I love the idea that at one point the great masked supervillain was revealed to be Nixon.
Yeah.
During Watergate. I mean, imagine today if they did a story and they pulled a mask off of the hate monger or something and it was Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
People would lose. It would be a nuclear explosion on Fox, and yet it would be just a retread of the same story they did 30, 40 years ago.
That's what really amazes me about this, when people say that the comic books have gotten too political. I'm like, they haven't even gotten close to what Englehart did back in the time.
No, what's changed is two things: media and social media. That's what have changed, because the media have changed in that there wasn't a media structure in the 1970s looking to capitalize off anything in popular culture that they could use to stir the pot, right? Today we have media organizations who microscopically search through everything constantly, looking to generate outrage.
Yeah.
And then number two, we didn't have the social media where you and I and everybody else can then go in and weigh in with our own informed or uninformed opinions about it. And so, I've always said, if Watergate happened today, Nixon would have still been president. He wouldn't have resigned, because there would have been a media machine to excuse him, and a social media machine to let people reinforce their opinions with each other that, oh, he's fine, it's okay, he didn't do anything wrong,
Right. So, I mean, that was the whole reason Roger Ailes had this dream of creating Fox News in the first place. It was all about, because he wanted this media infrastructure that would have protected Nixon. And Geraldo Rivera even gave away the game a few years ago when he was on Hannity. He told Hannity, if you were around during Watergate, Nixon would have gotten off.
Yep. Oh, 100%. Yeah. And so that's Captain America for sure. And I mean, what did Cap do half the time was fight like the Serpent Society, which was basically the Marvel's clan,
Right.
I mean, and then there's Iron Man, who his entire existence was, here's the capitalist, rich industrialist guy who has gotten rich and powerful off of literally war machines, off of weapons and all. The movies kind of touched on that, but they kind of very quickly moved on to, okay, he's seen the light, he's a hero. I guess the comics did too. But I've always thought that what's interesting about Iron Man, as opposed to immediately making him a superhero that goes out and tries to redress things, if the first Iron Man movie had been like a 12-episode Netflix series, the first 7 episodes would have still been him doing bad stuff.
Yeah.
And then he would be learning slowly. It would be about his transformation from a ruthless industrialist who doesn't care that poor kids are getting blown up by his bombs and stuff. And that's a very political thing, because there are people that think superheroes are supposed to just be black and white or 4-color, and don't change and are just there to beat up the bad guys. But I guess that also, by the way, raises the question of who and what are the villains, because I think that the way Fox News and some of their supporters see it is the villain is very obviously somebody in a black hat who does things they don't like. But I think that a lot of the stuff that needs beating up, quote unquote, by the heroes is stuff like social injustice and racism and discrimination. And that's kind of what Marvel has always done, is said there's other kinds of villainy that needs beating up, metaphorically, besides just the guy robbing the bank or something.
Right. Well, that was the whole thing behind the X-Men. I mean, it was.
Yeah.
I mean, well, Stan and Jack, to be fair, they just used it as a very loose pretext when those early issues. But when Claremont came around, I mean, he dove full into that civil rights metaphor. And I was doing an Instagram post about this, and one of the images that I posted up was the very famous image of William Stryker from God Loves Man Kills pointing at Nightcrawler and like, you dare call that thing human, right? And and that was such a haunting comic, because right in the beginning you have these mutant kids being literally lynched, and from swing sets, if I'm not mistaken, and having the sign "Muty" on their posted on their chests.
Yeah, the X-Men has always been where they would go for the, I'm a different kind of person from you, but that doesn't make me less of a person kind of thing. Right. That's good. Cap has more of like the more political stuff historically, but the X-Men have more of like the social stuff. But they have different characters that go into those. I mean, Ms. Marvel came along in a very ham-fisted way for Marvel, though Claremont again has always been better about dealing with women characters. But she was kind of there to wave the flag for the women's liberation movement in the mid-'70s and everything. They've always had stuff like that going on for sure.
Right, because her launch, her debut as Ms. Marvel coincided with the launch of Ms. Magazine and all that.
Yeah, and she was a magazine editor at the beginning of
exactly.
Yeah.
And then you look at and you have it on the other side too, because if you go back, and it's one of the things that amuses me when I see someone like Chuck Dixon going out and decrying politics in comics, because you go back and you read some of the Batman stuff or the Punisher stuff he did in the 90s, like it is, it's like a conservative wet dream.
Oh yeah. And my dear friend Mike Barron, I mean, he's similar in his views, but if you read Nexus, there's so much politics in it. There always was. It's about governing a diverse society. I've always had a hard time. I love him to death. He's a good friend, but I've always had a hard time reconciling his personal views with what he wrote in all the comics, which are about having a pluralistic, diverse society of all these people that don't look the same and are refugees welcomed in. I mean, the whole planet is refugees. And I'm just like, how did you? So yeah, I've never looked for great consistency in comic creators, because they're just people like anybody else, and there's not always going to be a great ideological.
Yeah, I mean, you do have that because, in a lot of ways, the whole idea of the superhero, right? You have this this individual taking it upon himself to, right what he perceives as the wrongs in society. That is, kind of a conservative idea in when you break it down to that level.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying, is that you have to kind of define what kind of villains and villainy you're going after. And if you just limit it to beating up the bank robber, or in the 60s, tracking down the communist secret agent, there was a lot of that.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing I was going to mention.
It just reminds me of my favorite line from Fantastic Four #1 is, "We have to get to space before the commies do."
Yeah. See, that's, to me, one of my favorite things that I always like to see when I read these books about Marvel history, is how they would walk a fine line. Because on the one hand, Stan always wanted, and Goodman, I'm sure, always wanted Marvel to seem like they were like right up there at the forefront. Go USA, USA #1. We're an all-American, red-blooded American company publishing stories about great American heroes doing great American stuff. But at the same time, they're a company that was mostly Jewish, as we said, right?
Yeah.
And reflected a lot of sensibilities of that community, certainly coming out of the 40s, the Holocaust and everything, my gosh. And then they were also a very progressive group of people, maybe not Goodman, but Stan and some of the others. And they wanted to push the idea of, I mean, if you read any of Stan's soapbox, over those years, it was always anti-racism and inclusivity, including others, and diversity and all that stuff. So they always tried to put on I don't want to say a conservative face, but kind of like just a very moderate, we're just here to tell good stories face. But they've always been very effective, and intentionally so, at getting those social issues and political issues and their viewpoints on them.
Yeah. You've read Marvel Comics: The Untold Story, I assume, right?
Yeah. Right behind.
I was thinking exactly of that, because Stan was very much a very middle of the road kind of guy, like, progressive for his time in a lot of ways, but very much wanting to kind of hew to the center, right? And but then you had all these very left creators coming in, like, you had Englehart, you had Steve Gerber, Denny O'Neil, Chris Claremont, all these guys who had very, very progressive politics, and like and they were merciless in there. Like when, Englehart's, running Captain America, when he came in and, he looked back at the 50s commie smashing Cap and he's like, oh no, we're not going to have that. And he just completely, turned that all over on his head. And then that guy later ends up becoming a literal white supremacist.
Yeah, it was a different Captain America. I love it. I love that. I love the idea that, and it's just saying, a Captain America that does not live up to the ideals that Captain America should live up to, we're just going to go ahead and remove him from being Steve Rogers. He was never actually Steve Rogers. Yeah. And I'm glad. Yeah.
Yeah. And which was later picked up as well and done to great effect and very astute, social and political commentary by Ed Brubaker in his Captain America run when he did the Two Americas storyline. It was brilliant the way he did it, and it tied in perfectly with the whole rise of the Tea Party stuff that was happening at that time as well.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that was really smartly written stuff during those years. I had great respect for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you read any of the Ta-Nehisi Coates Captain America stuff?
No, I have not.
No, it's pretty good. You can't. It's hard. It's almost impossible to top Brubaker, but it is really good stuff. And he's doing a lot of the same type of. You can tell that he's very much influenced by what Brubaker did on his run. And also going along with that line is, what was I going to say? Oh, obviously the big one too is Alan Moore, right? Because
oh yeah,
and when you mentioned when you started saying HBO, I thought you were going to say Watchmen because that was such a political show. And when people were complaining about it, and Derrick and I went in depth with 3 episodes talking about the whole series, but I mean, you go back and you look at the Watchmen comics and you look at it in the political lens of the time. I mean, Alan Moore is, about as progressive as you can get. I mean, he's an anarchist, full on. Right? So, I mean, that's the whole thing. That was the whole plot of V for Vendetta. It was all about anarchism versus fascism.
Yeah, I read Watchmen in the early 90s. I missed it when it first came out. I guess it came out in the late 80s, right?
Yeah, 87 if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. But it was talk about political. I mean, I love the idea that it was it I know they used Nixon, like Nixon was in his 7th term or something crazy, but wasn't there also Robert Redford as a stand-in for Ronald Reagan running around? And it's been a while since I read it.
So that happened at the end. So Nixon was in his 4th term because it was set in the 80s, and it was in a world where, because Dr. Manhattan was able to win Vietnam, Nixon was able to get term limits abolished. Vietnam became the 51st state and all this kind of stuff. And then and the brilliant thing about Watchmen is all this stuff is happening in the background. Like, you don't notice it the first time you're reading it. Like you realize, oh, Nixon's still president. That's interesting. But you don't really realize all the political stuff that's happening in the background. Like, there's one scene where the comedian talks about, he's at a party. He says, he's like, well, Woodward and Bernstein were easier than this. Right. Meaning, like, he killed them before they revealed anything. And then there's a mention of Ronald Reagan, Robert Redford at the end. Because at the end of it, in the closing pages, they mentioned that Robert Redford is considering a run for president. And then the Watchmen TV show picked up on that, and he's been president ever since the end of Watchmen, basically. So he won that election, and then he's been president ever since into the modern day.
Well, I just remembered they said RR, and you're thinking Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
The actor RR, and then it's not Ronald Reagan, which I thought was pretty clever. But yeah, I haven't finished. I've watched part of the Watchmen series, but I didn't watch the whole thing yet,
it's so good. It's again, brilliant use of, just like Alan Moore did back then, where he took contemporary politics, the Cold War politics and all that, and he merged them into this superhero world. Damon Lindelof did the exact same thing with the TV show. He took the modern politics that we're dealing with now, and whereas Moore set it in a world where it was, like the most conservative president that could happen in that kind of situation, and he takes it the other way, where you have the most progressive president. So you're in a world where there are reparations and all that kind of stuff has already been enacted, and there's this, I assume you saw the first episode. You say you've watched some of it, but that scene where the cop is pulling the guy over and he needs to get permission to unlock his gun even. So like it does a really good job of like flipping it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. I do remember that. So.
And what was the other one I was going to mention? Frank Miller is another one that comes to mind too. When you go back and you look at, because Frank Miller has gotten really weird in his later years, but you go back and you read The Dark Knight Returns, and this kind of goes to what you were saying about how that differences in ideology versus the execution, because you look at Dark Knight Returns, and in a lot of ways, it's a conservative power fantasy. But in other ways, it's almost like a satire too, because you got the whole stuff with Reagan, you got all the media criticism going on at the same time too. So and he's kind of attacked, and he also has that scene where Carrie Kelly's parents, they're sitting on the couch, they're smoking pot, and they don't notice that their teenage daughter is dressing up as Robin and sneaking out onto the ledge.
Well, I think you hit on something very interesting there. One of the issues or problems with the far right, is that a lot of the time when you parody them or what they like, they don't see it as a parody. They see it as, oh yeah, I like that. You know, so like if you show somebody going out and just mercilessly beating up villains and getting a little collateral damage as well, we might go, oh gosh. And they'd be like, well, got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. That's cool. Beat up some more people, you know. So it doesn't always register in the intended way with those on the receiving end.
Well, I mean, Rorschach is a perfect example of that, right? Because
yeah,
the whole idea of Rorschach was, this is a man who is broken. He's psychopathic. He's paranoid. I mean, when you look back at that comic book, Rorschach is a really shitty detective. He only stumbles upon this thing by accident. It just happens he's a broken clock that ends up being right twice a day. That's what it is. But like he finds out Edward Blake's dead. He finds out he's the comedian, and then he goes in this bar and starts breaking fingers, but nobody really knows what's going on there. And you know, and that was one of my biggest criticisms of the movie that Zack Snyder did, was it tries to justify Rorschach's actions and Rorschach's paranoia. Because there's that one scene where he thinks he's talking about Veidt, and he says, "Oh, Veidt's a possible homosexual." And then in the movie, they have this scene where they're on Veidt's computer, and there's a folder labeled "boys," which was never the intention originally. It was just an example of how paranoid Rorschach is. But other people see this and they see Rorschach and they think, "Oh, this guy's cool. He's breaking fingers."
Right. He's figuring it out. And I could see a movie studio saying, no, you got to have somebody who's more heroic. So don't make him just be imagining that. Make it true so that we can be like, yeah, he was right. Go get him. You know,
I think that's probably more Zack Snyder, because he's an objectivist to begin with. So
yeah. I hadn't thought about that. I'm glad you said that, because I hadn't really. I look at the Watchmen movie and think I really enjoy that movie, but I hadn't thought of it on a granular level of like how it's altering the intention of the comics that much.
It is. And you can go back and listen, because we did an episode on the Watchmen movie way back in the day. I think it was episode 7 or something, if I'm remembering correctly. But the thing the movie did was the book did a really good job of making these characters three-dimensional and really kind of showing that it really criticizes like that conservative power fantasy, the idea of like, you know, this person who takes it upon himself to right the perceived wrongs in society. And it shows these people as being really broken and psychologically damaged. And it really says, like, do you really want these people going out there and, you know, taking it upon themselves to righting wrongs? And that's a criticism that's heaped on all the characters, not only Rorschach. Rorschach's just the most extreme example. But the movie, you know, it portrays them in much more heroic fashion. And I didn't notice this until I rewatched the movie and, you know, compared it with reading the book, is that most of the other characters, their stories are very stripped down in the movie, even in the like the 3-hour director's cut. But Rorschach's story and the comedian's story are almost uncut and told in a much more sympathetic light.
Yeah. Oh, and more sympathetic. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. Because you want, yeah. And then and that would make sense. And the funny thing is that it ended up not appealing to either side, really, because
right. Yeah.
yeah. So,
so also, and I'm thinking too, as well as that, intention versus execution thing. And I think about Mark Miller, because Mark Miller is a very left-wing guy, very progressive, but you read some of his comics and they're very regressive in a lot of their politics, their depictions of women especially. And you go back and you read the Ultimates, and you can think in some way, maybe he's it seems like he's trying to do satire, but it doesn't seem to be landing very well. And
yeah, that's the thing. I mean, with so much of that's the problem with doing parody and satire of the of that right-wing stuff, is that it's hard to tell where the reality begins and ends and where the satire begins, because there's so little difference between a parody of that and the actual thing. It's very difficult. Oh, the Ultimates, man, I talk about, I try to put that, I don't know. I have I want to say I have a love-hate relationship, but the thing about the Ultimates for me was, I've always been kind of Mr. Avengers in a way. And so getting like an updated, slick modernization of them that obviously would lend itself more to television or movies, and this was before the MCU, obviously,
right?
That there was a big appeal to that, and I was like, oh, okay. And several friends and I were kind of bubbling about, oh, we've got this new deluxe treatment going back to the beginning, but the way that they executed it really was, I mean, like you say, I mean, it's written by somebody that you wouldn't have thought would have taken it that direction, but it really does. There's a lot of ugliness to it. I put it that way.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of ugliness to the original Avengers, right? It was a lot of happiness, a lot of positive. It was like, yay, let's get together. And it was very, very innocent, I think is a way to put it, And the Ultimates really try to take away all the innocence and say, let's make it gritty and more quote unquote realistic. And it ends up just taking a lot of characters that I don't think it makes them more three-dimensional as much as it makes them just less, there's a difference between making a character multi-dimensional versus just taking them dark, that's just a sharp turn in one direction. And it particularly Captain America, that was just egregious. Turning him into a bully. And that says a lot. Again, if Captain America is supposed to represent, be a reflection of America, then the Ultimates Captain America is saying an awful lot about how that America must be.
Which is kind of depressing. Yeah, because like you, I also have kind of a love-hate relationship with that comic, because when it came out, I was in high school, university, and I loved it when it came out. And I had only recently gotten into the Avengers. I had gotten in with Buzik's run. So it was kind of weird, because Buzik was my introduction to the Avengers, and it's very much, old school, the classic distillation of what the Avengers are. It's all it's like a pure shot of heroin of the Avengers, basically. But then I also saw the Ultimates, and I'm like, and I really liked that too. It reminds me of when I was a kid watching, being introduced to both Batman 66 at the same time as introduced to Batman 89, and, having this love for both of them. So it was that kind of dichotomy going on back then. And looking back on it, because I had reread the Ultimates, for the first time in 20 years or so, about a year or two ago, and just reading it and thinking God, this is not that good. It's just very, very mean-spirited, like you were saying. It's just, and the characters aren't well developed at all. They're very flat. They're extremely flat. It's just, but now that I'm thinking about it too, I was thinking about it again when I was thinking about this episode, and thinking about, well, it was in the early 2000s. It was in the whole Iraq War period and all that. And I think that was kind of what Millar was trying to do, was he was trying to comment on American imperialism and all that. But he did it in a way that felt very ham-fisted, whereas you compare it to something like what Ennis was doing on Punisher Max at the same time, felt a lot more deep, right? Compared to but I think that's a lot down to Miller, because he's not a very deep guy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exactly right. Is it didn't develop the characters and make them more human. It just made them flat in a different way,
Right.
which is not the same thing.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
and it's very disappointing if you already love those characters. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like something that, you know, an Elseworlds that DC would have done, where Superman just is basically like in Injustice or whatever. I mean, it almost like an Injustice for the Avengers.
It is, yeah. And so you mentioned Superman there at the end too, and that's something else I wanted to talk about, because Superman is also one of those characters, very much like Captain America, who's interpreted as very much like, you know, conservative American values type of character. But when you look at his backstory, like, yeah, he was raised in the Midwest and the Bible Belt and all of that, but I mean, he's an illegal immigrant.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I would say he's an anchor baby if the Kryptonians had come by.
Yeah. Well, I mean, not only is he an illegal immigrant, he's a refugee too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I remember a few years ago when I think it was Straczynski. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it was Straczynski did this story where Superman went on television and quote unquote renounced his U.S. citizenship, even though he technically wasn't a U.S. citizen to begin with. But
yeah.
but you know, he was always perceived as a U.S. citizen and being like a tool of the U.S. And so he made this whole show of renouncing his U.S. citizenship. And I also remember in Superman Returns came out, and Perry White has that line, does he still stand for truth, justice, all that stuff? And again, there's a conservative freak out about both those things.
You know, it's interesting. That's there's so much about Superman I've always said the least interesting thing about Superman is that he's a superhero that flies around and punches bad guys. Mm-hmm. That's the least interesting thing. To me, one of the most the most interesting thing about Superman is that he has those powers and he chooses to use them the way he does, and that's been done a million times. But the other, to me, interesting thing is that he's an alien who could look like anything. He could look like a tree. He could look like an octopus, but he looks like a white guy, and he lands in the middle of Kansas full of other white people.
Mm-hmm.
And if he had just been exactly the same but looked like a Hispanic guy, how different would the whole story have been? Just if his skin had been a little darker on this alien, right, who could look like an octopus, but he looked like a human, and his skin had just been a little darker, which is like 1/1 billionth change, you know, in an alien. Think how different that story would have been, because would he then still represent the ideal of to a lot of people? I don't know. I think he would have been seen as a very different thing. So,
well, it looks like we might actually be getting that story, because the Superman movie that J.J. Abrams is producing, they're looking at a black Superman apparently.
Oh, here comes. It's going to be Armageddon on Fox, man, and all those others. It's going to be open season,
especially because Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing it. So.
Oh boy. Well, I mean, there's as much chance as not right now that the next James Bond could be black. Mm-hmm. And there's, you know, in addition to Idris Elba, there's another figure now, I forget his name, that's in the running. And so, man, there's going to be so much angst and outrage. Just buckle up now.
Well, there's also been rumors that for Professor X and Magneto, when Marvel reboots the X-Men, which they're going to do at some point,
sure,
there have been rumors that they're looking at actors of color to play Professor X and or Magneto.
Mm-hmm. You see, it's one of these things where on the one hand I could totally see, for example, particularly a black actor playing Magneto, but on the other hand, that's almost like too on the nose, you know? I mean, it's like,
yeah.
If you're doing Martin Luther King and Malcolm X or something, do you really want the Malcolm X figure to be black? I mean, wouldn't that like we've gone from metaphor to almost like specific representation? I don't know, but
well, that was
to have it the other way around. You know?
that was actually one of the issues they had when Marvel was debating whether or not Magneto was actually Jewish, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust or not.
Right.
Because I'm not sure if you know this, but back in the 90s, they had kind of revealed that he wasn't Jewish, he was Romani. And then later that kind of got that later got undone because and surprisingly enough, they did it that way because they were worried about Jewish backlash. Like, they're worried about, oh, you've got this genocidal villain and he's Jewish. But it turns out that it was the Jewish community who actually protested against the fact that Magneto was no longer Jewish.
Yeah, Magneto and I guess Wolverine have, it seems like their background changes every time the wind blows. So I can't keep, but particularly Magneto. I mean, he's had 15 different names. He's had 15 different ethnic and national backgrounds, and he's that old, but he's this old, but it's crazy. So yeah, but that's interesting though, because he is a really good example of how changing politics and changing cultural values over the years get reflected in characters like that. I think that it affects Captain America, as we were talking about, in one way, because Captain America doesn't really change, but he reacts differently to what's going on. Whereas somebody like Magneto is actually changed by the creators to reflect the current thinking and everything. So
right. Yeah. And let's see. Any other big examples you can think of superhero politics that we really kind of mentioned so far?
Well, certainly Black Panther has always had a role in how we view the third world and developing countries. I mean, he's not, the interesting thing about him is that he's not an African American. He is an African with money, with power, and with technology even better than America's, and so he kind of came along as a way of, I thought, I guess Jack Kirby was to a large part responsible for it, right? As sort of a way of telling, Americans, you're not, there's no law that says white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have to be the top of the pyramid. It could be, somebody else. And here's what it might be like.
Yeah. And that's a very good point. And also that also deals, that's one of the things I think the movie did really well, was the ideas of, dealing with imperialism and all that, and how Wakanda had flourished partly in a large part because it was closed off from all this imperialism for so long, which was how it was able to flourish. Whereas the rest of Africa was decimated by white imperialism.
And they have to make that choice. Do we want to be selfish and just kind of worry about ourselves, or do we want to open up and try to help others in our plight, or in the whole world if it's like Thanos, but at the risk of opening the door to bad stuff coming in? For me, that was one of the best things about the Black Panther movie, was the moral dilemmas that the Wakanda people faced. Because they're really at this interesting crossroads in so many ways. They've got a monarchy, and yet they're more progressive than a lot of people. How do you justify having even an enlightened monarchy in a day and age when, if you're that much more advanced, you should have like a greater democracy than we do, and yet you're behind Britain, and you're behind a lot of places in some ways. And then the whole isolationist argument, which is a great reflection for our isolation argument in the 1930s and 40s. So yeah, I thought that those elements of Black Panther were excellent and were really well portrayed in the movie, for sure.
Yeah, there's that one scene, those two competing scenes where you had Nakia, who's talking about, we can help refugees, we can other countries do it, we can do it better. And then you had God, I'm blanking on his name, but the guy Daniel Kaluuya played, who says, he's like, you bring in refugees come, they bring their problems with them. And so you had that whole argument, like the whole xenophobia thing. Plus you had that whole, tradition versus modernization thing with, it's this very high tech society, but at the same time, they're still doing trial by combat. And so, like this kind of being slave tradition type things. And just the fact, just how progressive Black Panther was for the time, because even still today, but especially back then, because he's basically Batman, but richer, smarter, and more powerful. And he has his own country.
And he has his own country and an
he's
army.
black.
And everything else. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And it's a good point too there that they're critiquing, a lot of they're critiquing how other societies do things, but yet they're also revealing that they have those same issues too. They're not perfect, and they're having to wrestle with them too. So that's very effective. Yeah.
And it's also it works, and what makes Killmonger such a great villain, because you look at Killmonger and he's pointing out all the flaws in the hero's argument, and in such a great way. Like, you look at someone like the Red Skull, and don't get me wrong, the Red Skull is a very effective villain, but there's not really a silver lining in fascism. I mean, but when you listen to Killmonger talking, and you're like, even me as a white guy, I'm thinking, this guy's making some good points here. Like, yeah, we have done a lot of shit.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Very effective. I mean, again, that's just Marvel and comics and superhero type stories at their best, is when they're both a very effective on the surface story and a character story, but they're also metaphorical. They're also carrying with them so many ideas of saying, you need to think about this. And I mean, that kind of brings around the whole point of this is that, if one of the great strengths of superhero stories and superheroes and comics and all that, one of their great strengths is being metaphors and making us think about issues, then telling them not to be political is telling them to stop doing one of the things that they do best, and one of the best services they provide for the society.
Well, I mean, and that's the whole thing about storytelling, because, and I do this when I teach my class in literature and film. Like, I tell my students, these stories aren't created in a vacuum. Even if a writer is trying to be as apolitical as possible, and this as a writer yourself, you can't help being influenced by what's happening in society in some way.
Yeah. If you go back and read, the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff from 120 years ago, at the time, he wasn't trying to be political or racially controversial at all. And yet we read it today and go, ugh, because it's a product of its time. And like you say, even if you're not intentionally injecting that stuff in it, just the fabric and the texture of the world at the time you're writing it is going to be very obvious later, if not then. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you look at it, and you even look at it with, progressive types of moves, like, female superheroes or something like that back in the 1960s. Like, you read some of those early Fantastic Four issues, and the way Sue acts, like, Jesus, you're kind of surprised she hasn't, hurt herself in some way. She's almost like written as mentally damaged in some cases.
Yeah, it's and in the Justice League, you have Wonder Woman being the secretary.
Oh yeah,
it's unbelievable but it's funny though, because if you see how women characters were treated in comics at that time, it's not that different from how they were treated in television and movies and stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. I've been watching. Speaking of Perry, I've been watching the original season 1 and 2 of Perry Mason, and it's wonderfully written. But the secretary there is, you can see that she keeps trying to do stuff, and they're like, no, Della, you should stay here in case the phone rings. She's like an answering machine. You stay here in case the phone rings. Paul and I are going to go handle this.
Yeah.
And she's like, and then as they walk out the door, you'll see her kind of go and throw down her notebook. And I'm like, well, at least they show that, right?
Yeah.
At least they show that the woman is frustrated by it. So, and by the way, I can make a superhero connection here too that you're not going to believe. The secretary on the original Perry Mason is in real life, the mother of the greatest American hero, William Catt.
Oh,
I didn't realize that. If you look at her and put crazy blonde hair on her, you totally see him. So there you go. But, and by the way, I can also make an HBO connection, which is that they recently did a Perry Mason reboot.
That's right. Yeah.
And they totally, just like we were saying, if the original Perry Mason was and I don't go off that, but it's like a comic book. It's a lawyer comic book. He's a lawyer superhero, honestly. If you look at how it was back in the 50s and 60s when they were doing it, the 2020 Perry Mason, not a big spoiler, but at the end, the Della Street secretary says, you're going to pay to send me to law school so I can be your partner. And he's like, okay, which is so much of is showing how things have changed, right? back in the 60s, nobody would have objected to her just sitting there answering the phone. But by 2020, we're like, why? She's clearly as smart as he is. Why is she not, a partner? And they can address that now. So these kind of stories, in whatever format, they do such a great job of bringing these issues to the surface,
Yeah, that was to tie it into pulp stuff for a second here. I remember a few years ago reading Barry Reese's Lazarus Gray stories, and you had like this Korean American character in there, and just like the way Barry wrote that character, and you could tell he really did his research on what Korean Americans were going through back in that time period, and just incorporating all that stuff. Which if Barry Reese had been born and back then and been writing in the 1920s, none of that stuff would have been there at all.
No, absolutely right. Yeah, that's one of the great arguments in new pulp, that we have today is there are certain things from back then that we're trying to preserve and bring back and celebrate. But there's quite a bit of baggage also that we kind of have to say, and that's an argument. And I don't think that to the credit of the new pulp writers and artists community and editors community and publishers, I don't think there are very many saying, keep the racism, keep the sexism, I mean, within the bounds of reason, right? We can be a little more enlightened about it, or at least see their perspective or their frustrations, even if you don't show a person of color or a woman, whatever, having the opportunities back then, you can at least show that they wanted them and that they're frustrated they didn't get it, which is kind of like Della throwing down the Notebook,
Right, yeah.
That was very progressive for that time, because the expectation of the public would have been that she'd have gone, oh, okay, and then smiled, and instead she's like, bang. So it's, you can at least represent that they are feeling neglected, that they are feeling put upon and being largely overlooked, mistreated, whatever.
Yeah, and there's also the argument now that people say that you're injecting too much politics into characters who haven't previously been political. And my favorite example of that is Green Arrow, right? You go back to Green Arrow back when he was first created in the 1940s, 1950s, whatever it was. He was just Batman with a bow and arrow. That's all he was. It's just you swap bat, you change everything from bat to arrow, and then it's a Green Arrow. Like he had an arrow cave, an arrow copter, an arrow car, all that kind of stuff. And then when Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams brought him into Justice League, they wisely said, we're gonna get rid of all that, and basically they turned him into Bernie Sanders with a bow and arrow.
That's true. Yeah. That was one of my favorite moments in Injustice, is when they're in the arrow cave and Harley Quinn says, you can call it the quiver, and he's like, that's actually pretty good. But I remember he was always that way. He's always been I mean, I'm not a huge DC specialist, but has he not always been like the farthest to the left of any major DC character, at least in overt?
Since O'Neil and Adams, yeah.
Right.
But yeah, and even I remember when the Arrow TV show first came out, and there was actually people criticizing it for being too progressive, and I'm like, he's not even close to being as far left as Green Arrow was in the comic books. And then you had that landmark run, the Green Lantern Green Arrow comic series that O'Neil and Adams did, which dove deep into issues of racism and environmentalism and issues that, like, you go back and you read those issues, it's amazing how relevant they still are today.
Yeah, the thing I always found interesting, I've read those. I have that trade paperback around here somewhere, and the thing that always struck me was interesting was that I can totally see Green Arrow in that story because he fit it perfectly. He's a street level character, and he's got a lot of interests in politics and ideology and all that. I always had trouble with Green Lantern being part of it because they basically turn him into a street level character. And he was good. He was a good foil, obviously, because he's the one kind of being surprised and learning about all this stuff. But I just kept thinking, you've almost got an Infinity Gauntlet, man. Why you could just fix all this, But other than that, it was a small complaint, Other than that, though, it was brilliant. So
yeah, I remember thinking that at the same time, and when I was reading those stories too. And I'm not sure how much of it had to do just because of the fact that this was the only way they could do Green Arrow stories, was doing it in a Green Lantern book or whatever it was. But or you could also look at it as a metaphor of Green Lantern being this establishment hero, being very much, so having all this power to change stuff and not doing it.
And not, yes. Well, that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, it's like, and I mean, I think Bendis touched on this a little bit in New Avengers, where Luke Cage is like, why are we not out like helping the community? Why are we sitting around Avengers Mansion, playing pool or drinking beer or whatever, when we could be out, using our powers for more good than just beating up Graviton again? And so that's like the one thing Bendis ever did that I thought was actually intelligent.
That was something I like that Morrison did when he did the X-Men, is the fact that because it's all the concept of the X-Men has always been, it's a school, but they've only had at most 10 students at a time. And, Morrison just said, nope, we're opening the doors. We're having we're loading it up with students, and then we're doing mutant outreach too, in the global level. And that was something I thought made a lot of sense. And well, yeah, if you're supposed to be fighting for equality, you're not really doing much good. Very similar to what you said about the Avengers sitting in their mansion. Like the X-Men are sitting in this mansion, not even in the center of New York, like up in Westchester, not talking to anybody.
No, they're just up there in the country club, I guess, area, just, in a rich place.
And occasionally going out to space.
Yeah. And again, you could make that great argument if you're more concerned about people that are blue than people that are black,
Yeah. So that was one of the nice changes I thought that was made, is, having this rule. No, if we're going to be fighting for mutant human equality, we should actually be out there doing mutant outreach. So that was one of the things that, and that's kind of one of the interesting things about superhero comics too, because, and I think Watchmen did a really good job of illustrating this, is you have this situation where these heroes literally can change the world, but they don't, because the world in the comics still has to reflect the real world that we all live in. And Watchmen said, well, here's what it would really look like. And because in Watchmen, there's only one superhero powered being, and he changes everything.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, they have Superman and then a whole lot of Batmans, basically.
Yeah.
And so there's no counterpoint. And I like the idea that even he gets so frustrated, just leaves. He's like, I'm done with you people.
Well,
and if he's a Jesus metaphor, then Jesus is like, screw it, I'm out of here. You aren't even worth saving. So
yeah, I mean, that's one of the other great things about it, is the fact that, you get all this power, and you can look at it as a metaphor, like when, people become rich and they stop caring about little people. It's very easy to see the same thing happen to superhero, right? He has all this power, and the rest of the people do look like ants to him, and he just stops caring about them.
Yeah. It shows the difference, but in the scale, I mean, it really is. And I guess Batman is even being too much, right? It's Superman, and then, a guy like, Hawkeye or something, even less formidable than Batman, really. So.
Okay. So Van, this is a great discussion. It was a lot of fun talking about this. Any final things you'd like to mention? Anything we haven't?
No, I'm glad that you're bringing this out to people's attention, because it's absolutely true that, I mean, the whole point of superheroes and comics is partly to entertain. I mean, I see this is the last thing that I thought of that we haven't really touched on, is one of the defenses that the other side makes is it's to entertain. It's about entertainment. The number one job is to entertain. Well, sure, nobody argues that. But what good is hollow entertainment if you also don't learn a little bit, or at least get something to think about? And so any story needs to entertain, or there's no point telling it. But it's like hollow calories if you don't get a little vitamin in there too. And there's room for both. And I think there's a necessity for both. And you can't just lean on but it should taste good. Well, I mean, tons of sugar tastes good too. And then you got diabetes and you're dead or something. I mean, you need some medicine in there. You need some vitamins. You need some nutrients at least. And that's what I think a lot of this stuff is. And these are people that want their candy with no nutritional value, I'm afraid. And that's not how it's supposed to work.
Well, I think you can look at movies as a good example of that, because if you look at some of these, you take action movies, for example, okay? You take the James Bond movies, right? they're very much rooted in the politics of their time. They're very much rooted in the Cold War politics. But you take those movies, and that's why they're so popular, because they're contemporary. People can relate to them. But you compare it to like these Z-list direct-to-video asylum action movies or something like that nobody wants to see because they have no substance, because they have no message. Like, both of them give you what you're looking for. They both give you action, right? But one of them you actually want to see because you actually care about the characters and the world they live in. The other one you don't give a shit about because it's so hollow.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. Yeah. So.
Okay. So Van, anything you'd like to promote before we close up?
No, I guess if you want to check out my stuff, the easiest place is to go to www.plexico.net, plexico.net, not a .com.net. And I have links there to basically everything else. So all the podcasts, all the books, all the other various stuff is all at plexico.net.
Yeah. And I got to say, definitely check out the Sentinel series because it's very good stuff.
Thanks, sir. And I always appreciate all the great work that you've done with White Rocket, with Cold Lightning, and with Pulsar. You are our go-to guy, and I don't know where else I would go. So we're so glad to have you in the stable, man.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. I enjoy doing it. Like some of the stuff you put in there has definitely been. I had so much fun just designing the Pulsar logo.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah, I was so excited. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so that does it for us. Thanks again for watching. Thanks again for listening, and be sure to join us next time for another episode. If you want to support us in any way, go to superherocinephiles.com. There's a Patreon on there. There's Buy Me a Coffee, PayPal, any way you can help contribute to the show. If you want to come on the show at all, drop me a line through the contact form. And also Super Cinema Pod on Instagram and Twitter, and Super Cinephiles on Facebook. Thanks so much for watching, and we will talk to you next time. You have been listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Super Cinema Pod. Join our Facebook group by searching for Superhero Cinephiles, where you can interact with us and other superhero fans. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a regular supporter at Patreon or make a one-time donation through PayPal, both of which can be found at our website, superherocinephiles.com. If you buy or rent any movies through the Amazon links at our site, it helps support the show. Please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.